Hey everybody, this is Tim Smith. I am an engineer here at Chef, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about converting a traditional LWRP into a custom resource. Custom resources are something we introduced in Chef 12.5, so definitely everybody out there should have a version of Chef that is capable of using custom resources. And really, I'd like to think of them as kind of LWRPs 2.0. LWRPs had been around for a while. We had added a lot of functionality to them. And in custom resources, we really went about refining the LWRP experience and making it that much easier for you to write your own resources. So I'm going to look at a cookbook here. I think this is a fairly good example of some of the weird things you might run into. It's called Ruby Build. It has a traditional resource provider directory, which tells you that this is an LWRP. There's the resource side of things here, and then there is the provider side of things here. So the first thing I'm going to do as we start out is just copy the entirety of the provider into the resource, because we really don't need it in the provider. And we can just delete this entire provider because we don't need providers anymore. It's just resources. All right, so that is the first step. Pretty simple stuff. The second step is these actions and default actions. We don't need those anymore. So you can see that we have two different actions in this cookbook. We have action install and action reinstall. The first action is actually the default now. So that gets rid of the entire need for this. And then we don't have to define things twice. So we don't have to define our actions up here and then later in here, because we're all in one file now, which makes it super easy. Then the next part is this use inline resources. This was something we introduced actually in Chef 11. It's the default for custom resources now, so you'll see that pretty much defined in every traditional resource. It's definitely something you don't need anymore. All right, so let's continue on and see what we can do. The next thing you probably want to do, this is kind of a resource that's broken up, with a lot of methods. We want to set our action class. Our action class is where we stick all the helpers that are used by the actions. And this allows us to scope our variables correctly. So anywhere we'd be using variables that we set up in these properties. These will be properties in just a moment. Anytime we use one of those values, definition, user, whatever, if we use it in one of these, we need it to be in the action class. So we'll stick the whole thing in the action class. And then we don't have to worry about private or any of that, because there really is no private. It's not really a thing. So the next part is we're going to change all the occurrences of attribute over to property. Attribute was a really bad choice for words, it turned out. Attribute was used in multiple places in Chef, and it means different things depending on what context you're in. So we changed it to properties, which makes a lot more sense. And you can kind of avoid the confusion of talking about like your node attributes or your attributes in your resources, because now it's just properties. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of all these kind ofs. Kind of is no longer a thing. It would work if we had that, but it works better without it. The type for the property is just the second item. So property, a name, a type, and then a whole bunch of different things. In this case, all we have is just name property, but there's all kinds of different stuff you can use on your properties. Now this is kind of a weird one. So we're doing things in load current resource. Load current resource is something you see a lot when you're doing like a resource that is entirely built with Ruby, as opposed to using Chef resources, where you're actually loading in the state. In this case, that's not actually what this person's doing. So this is something you definitely don't need to do. They're just setting some variables in there. They're kind of using this like if you're more familiar with Ruby programming, using this like they're initializing a class, setting some global, some class variables. We definitely don't need to do that. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to find everywhere we're using this Ruby, and we're going to replace it with new resource definition, because that's what we really mean. And we can just do this basically. Yeah, except right there. All right, so that gets rid of that first one. The next one here, what we're actually doing with this is we're trying to set a default. So they're setting this prefix path they're saying, hey, if the user passed it in, use the value the user passed in. If the user didn't pass it in, use this value. Now this gets a little bit weird because this should actually be a default, but it has to be a special kind of default because we're actually referencing this value to build this value, which means we have to use a special thing called lazy, which means we will evaluate it at the very last moment we possibly can. And then because we want to use the resource, we're going to do it like this. We are going to use r.definition. So now we will return this value here. We will lazily evaluate it at the very last moment, and it'll come in as a default value. In your error messages in Chef, this will mean you'll actually get like the proper default value showing up. This will really improve troubleshooting of this resource. And then we can get rid of this prefix path variable because we're not using that anymore. Now we're actually just properly using new resource.prefix path, which is what we should be doing. And then we can get rid of this entire load current resource. All right, so now what we have is just a few properties. One of them has a default value. We have some actions, and those actions are just doing an install. So perform install is doing an update, and let's scroll down and kind of see what it's actually doing. So this perform install checks to see if Ruby is installed, and if it is not, it goes and installs it. So the problem we run into here, this does work. I might just leave it, to be honest. This updated by last action, this is not. This is kind of something we discourage people from using at this point. What we're doing here is we're performing some converges, and then we're deciding whether we should actually converge the resource or not. The problem is I don't think this is actually, again, I don't think this is going to work the way the person thinks this is going to work. Because we have this execute in here. And by the nature of this execute being in here, this whole thing's going to update itself. So I think what we can do is actually just convert this to a run. This is trying to make it compile time. There's no actual reason to do that here. You can skip that whole thing. So we can just delete that and see we've got this execute block. It's going to run. And that in itself, in running this, will update the resource. So what we can do is now we can just say perform install. There's no need to check any of this because this was, again, kind of going back to a Chef 11-ism where you had to actually manage if the resource had updated itself. So now what will happen here is if somebody says, hey, I want to install it, it'll do perform install. That'll run this method here, perform install. It'll check to see if Ruby is installed. It'll log. Yeah, if not, we can get rid of the false because we don't actually need perform install to return anything anymore. Then if it does need to be installed, it will go about installing it. So it's going to log and say, hey, this might take a while. Then we're going to set some variables here. Not entirely sure if this is still a true statement here, to be honest. Block scoping. I suspect that's not. We'll leave that. Then this execute statement will run. Now, this will always run. That's kind of an execute. That's the nature of it. There's no not if or only if to guard this. So this is always going to run. So anytime perform install gets called and Ruby is not installed, thus the else, this execute will run and it will update and it will say, hey, look, I converged. A resource has updated. And by that resource updating, that actually trickles up and that makes this entire resource update. So that as far as Chef is concerned, this install action or this reinstall action, whichever one you called, that will have run. And I think that is really it. Yeah. Oh, we can take out this other true, because again, we don't need to return anything. That method now just runs. It doesn't actually return a value. I'm just going to leave these here. They were commented out by somebody at some point. Not entirely sure what they're for. So that's it, really. You know, there is actually one more thing we can do here. We can make this a little bit better. Where does install Ruby dependencies get called? All right, yeah. Let's install these Ruby dependencies. So, again, we don't need to do this. They're forcing this in compile time by doing this. Not necessary. We can just do that. That will just install it. And then that will install it. There is a reason for this, actually. I'm going to leave this part out. The reason that we have this platform check, yeah, is because we still have some platforms where you can't just pass an array of packages in. So I think this is probably for people using like Homebrew, where we don't support that yet. And I promise someday I'm going to go spend the time to fix that, but it's actually surprisingly complex. So yeah, we'll pass that array in, and that'll very quickly install this if we're on RHEL or SUSE, Debian, whatever. But otherwise, we're going to iterate over all those packages, and then we're going to install them one at a time. So that's that. And it should work, like I said, without the weird stuff where we're forcing the action to run at compile time. I don't see why we would need this to run at compile time. The way resources run, this should be fine. Yeah, because that'll just install this, log. Technically, you'll see this message before the packages install. I think we can live with that. That's really the only thing you were getting. By forcing it to run at compile time, these kind of run in order. You get this running, this running, this running, whereas now you get Chef going through the two-phase. So you get a compile phase where it determines what it should do by compiling all the Ruby, and then you get a converge phase where it actually runs through each of the resources. This will build a resource out, and then we have a resource here, but all this Ruby in between will kind of run at the very beginning. So the very beginning, within that compile phase, you'll see it like log. It'll say, hey, this might take a while, even though it actually hasn't started. I don't think that that is the end of the world. Things should not be forced to run at compile time. So that's really it. That is a resource now. I'm not going to bore you with running it, but that's really what it takes, right? So we put everything into a single file, and a lot of what we're doing, honestly, is just deleting stuff. This is not the most complex example, but not the simplest. It had some weird stuff. You know, it had like this lazy eval that we had to do. It had that whole loading the current values. It really was kind of doing other things. It wasn't actually using that the way you would traditionally do that within Chef. And this had probably been around for a while. I think this looked like this recipe had probably been written in the Chef 10 days. So it had gone through a few different bits where people had added stuff on, maybe not entirely understanding what was going on under the hood in Chef. But this is kind of the basic process you'll go through. In the end, what you're going to end up here is a much simpler resource. You know, it's obviously a lot easier to read this. It's a single file, and it's significantly smaller. So thanks for watching this video, and hopefully I'll make a few more of these. Definitely